round 7, just to let you know this will be a silent round, so after the debate, you can go away, we're just going to cross the time. And good luck, everybody. Okay, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the case.
Very good.
Drug trafficking is unique among crimes in the modern era to the degree to which the externalities of drug trafficking affect the communities that the crime is committed in. The degree to which drug trafficking destroys communities in the country of consumption, causes urban blight in cities, and fundamentally harms not just the consumer, but the families and the community of those surrounding the consumer. It is for this reason that we on the proposition recognize a fundamental injustice in the international system, one in which many of those who are harmed by drug trafficking in the country of consumption fundamentally lack legal recourse to seek justice for the crimes they're committed against. In line with this, we on the proposition propose the following model. That members of the international community should enter an international treaty agreeing to extradite drug traffickers from the country of production to the country of consumption, that they should furthermore accept assistance from the countries of consumption in legal aid and law enforcement to capture these drug traffickers. And to be clear with this model, we're saying that drug trafficking is a crime that should be extradited to the point that drug traffickers also commit other crimes in the country of production, like extortion and murder. Those would still be tried within the country of production. Yes?
Isn't that case in this world where drug consumption is legal to the point that this person consumes the drug can sue a person who gives him the drug?
Yeah, we think that there's a number of layers here, right? Someone who produces drugs is a violation of the law in their home country, but it's also a violation of the law in the country of consumption, right? Drug trafficking is illegal in both places, and in the status quo, the trials take place only within the country of production. So we're just extending this legal framework to ensure that people are prosecuted for the crimes that they commit in both nations. So we see that there's two layers of analysis here that we need. No, thank you. We see that there's two layers of analysis here that we need to go into. The first is the moral argument. Why people in the country of consumption have a fundamental right to seek justice. And then second, the practical argumentation as to how implementation of this model will improve the efficacy of law enforcement and reduce the rate of drug production around the world. So the first is that if you look at the pattern of drug consumption, the way it affects communities, the harms are felt in the country of consumption to an even larger degree in the country of production. And we'll give you a couple of examples of this. Drug consumption in the United States from Mexico and drug consumption in Russia from Afghanistan, primarily. If you look at a city like Detroit, where there's a high rate of consumption of cocaine produced in Latin America and trafficked from Mexico, you destroy the communities because a small number of drug trafficking drives down, no thank you, a small number of drug trafficking drives down home values, it pushes people out of the community, and as a consequence of this, the whole neighborhood is destroyed, right? So society as a whole is harmed as a result of drug consumption. And we think that the society as a whole has a right to seek justice against these drug traffickers, insofar as that society is the one being harmed by the crime. Now, in addition to this, we think that it's important to note that drug trafficking and drug consumption is a violation of the laws in both countries, right? It's illegal to traffic drugs in the country of consumption, and currently that law isn't being tried. So that's the moral level. The idea that these communities that are being harmed have the right to seek justice. Yes.
What is your objection of putting this individual on trial in both cases, considering that they have broken laws in two places?
Yes, we think that drug traffickers commit lots of crimes other than drug trafficking, like extortion, like murder, like bribery, and they can be tried for those crimes in the country of production. So I don't think that objection is meaningful. It's just drug trafficking we're focusing on because of its unique moral status as a crime that hurts the consumers. So the second thing we want to talk about is the practical implications of this. The capture of the court system in countries of production, and why trying drug trafficking uniquely is beneficial in this case. Let's look at a case study of Mexico and the way that the judicial system works there. We see that the Mexican law enforcement, and particularly the use of Mexican naval units as a law enforcement arsenal, are reasonably effective at putting drug traffickers in the judicial system to begin with. The place where it falls apart is that the judicial system is captured by drug traffickers. They bribe the judges, they extort the juries, and as a result of this, there's no efficacy in the legal system for conviction. At the point that these countries are able to extradite the drug traffickers to countries like the United States and other countries in Western Europe, where a majority of the consumption takes place, those judicial systems are better able to try the drug traffickers, which will put them in prison. For an even more powerful example, let's look at what happens with Afghanistan and Russia, right? Afghanistan has a high rate of production of opium, which is imported into Russia. If Russia were able to cooperate with the Afghani government and offer law enforcement assistance to convict these opium traffickers, they'd be taken out of the Afghani court system, which is extremely unreliable, and convicted in Russia. So they'd be brought to justice in a way that doesn't happen in the status quo. So this is the first benefit we see. We see that the countries of consumption generally have better developed legal systems that are going to be more effective at convicting these people. But beyond that, we think that there's a more important benefit. And this is that we create a deterrent effect on drug traffickers. Currently, that deterrent effect isn't very strong. A drug trafficker in Latin America or in Afghanistan knows that because the legal system has been corrupted, there isn't really any threat to them as a result of production of drugs. Even if they were convicted, the fact that they've so distorted the legal system means that the punishment would be ineffective. But at the point that these drug traffickers know that they'd be tried in countries of consumption, like the United States, Russia, and Western Europe, that have much better developed legal systems that can resist this sort of corruption, the deterrent effect of law enforcement is much stronger, right? These drug traffickers would now realize that they'd be forced into a prison and would therefore look to avoid this sort of activity. So we deter them from engaging in drugs in the first place. What we also see is that in many of these cases, there's an important cost-benefit analysis that drug traffickers look at. It's actually fairly marginal in a lot of places for drug trafficking to be done. For example, let's look at Afghanistan again. Afghanistan was largely a producer of cotton prior to the United States invasion in 2001, which destroyed domestic law enforcement capability and made it more profitable to produce opium. At the point you have an improvement in the domestic law enforcement capability in these countries, drug traffickers would return to the previous cost-benefit analysis, return to producing cotton instead of opium, which both reduces the rate of harmful drug consumption around the world, and more importantly, benefits the local economy in that they're now producing a reasonable good for export that's legal, instead of being forced into reliance on production on illegal goods, right? The final benefit we see from this model is that it removes the incentive for drug traffickers to corrupt the legal systems of their host countries. At the point that they know that they're going to be tried outside of their home country, they know that the benefits to them for trying to corrupt the legal system are greatly reduced, which reduces pressure on the countries of production and makes it so that their legal system is more reliable and can be trusted more, both as a result of the reduced pressure and the assistance they're receiving from the internet. So what have we demonstrated in this round? We've demonstrated that drug consumption is a unique crime in the way that hurts the communities, and those communities have a moral right to seek recourse. And beyond that, there are practical benefits to which allowing extradition and trial in other countries improves the efficacy of law enforcement and reduces the likelihood of drug production in the future. And for that reason, we're proud of it. Here, here.
Okay, thank you for the speech. And I'd like to welcome our leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, if it just came down to justice, we think the Senate House would still win. We think there's a large part of the debate that the opening government missed, which is how do we actually solve the drug war, or what policy or method actually helps us to solve the drug policies inside both countries much more. Because at the very end of the day, while justice is important, we think another more important aspect of this debate is which side is best able to actually solve future crimes, stop future drug problems inside both of these countries, which actually leads to more justice, we think, as like crimes are stopped and people's lives are actually saved. So I have 3 points of constructive matter today. First, I'm talking about legal jurisprudence of this thing. Talk about why justice is more denied on their side of the house than our side of the house, to engage with what we thought OG mostly talked about. Second, I'm going to talk about the importance of sending drug traffickers back to their countries of production, and why you're actually going to be hurting the drug wars an incredible amount by not allowing countries of production to use their specific legal systems or their drug policy systems to interrogate or use these individuals. And third, I'm going to talk about why this current status quo policy actually de-incentivizes people to traffic more and actually create a more understanding in both sides of the country of what drug crimes are and where they actually start and where they end. So rebuttal will be interval. First, the legal jurisprudence. A very basic question I don't think the government OG addressed was why do we not prosecute foreign citizens in the majority of cases? We think principally it's because states only have power against their own citizens. We're not okay with the idea of saying the United States has the right and power to harm Mexican citizens because it deems the crime as too dangerous. For instance, we think this causes a myriad of problems legally. Because it takes away the power from the Mexican government. It delegitimizes their entire, and subverts their justice system. It hurts their ability to understand that what happens is crimes that start within Mexico are Mexico's business. This is actually something that, while it's very arbitrary, makes people very angry. There's a reason why Mexican drug authorities are very pissed off when American drug policy forces chase people into the Mexican borders and grab them because they did crimes inside the United States. This is an idea of jurisprudence that we think is violated. Of course, as I point out later, as all principles, there are pragmatic problems with this. But more importantly, on the issue of justice, we think our side gets much better justice for 4 reasons. First, if it's just the harm principle that the Prime Minister talked about which side gets harmed more, we think the country of production is hurt much more than the country of consumption. Things like Chicago neighborhoods having slightly lower values because there's a crime in there. It's much less, according to the 80,000 people who have died from the drug wars within the whole term of Felipe Calderon. We think what happens is with drug production pervasively causes problems in the neighborhoods, causes huge deaths, mass graves within the multiple states, creates huge problems within neighborhoods and people are like frightened to death. It creates huge problems within the state itself. If just the basis of harm principle, we think it's much worse for the side of the house to deny the justice to be in the locality of the Mexican area in order for those area people to see the justice occur, to see people go behind bars, and for people to actually get what they believe is a legitimate right to see the crimes taken care of. But we also contest, if you don't even buy that, what happens is if you think that people are happy with crimes being effective on both ends, we think that leads us to why we think justice is better served on this side as well. The second reason is because what happens is Mexico, or crimes where drug production occur, put more people in jail for crimes than the United States does. This seems a little bit counterintuitive, but there's a lot of reasons to why this is so. Like, for instance, if you look at Al Capone, he was able to use technicalities and a lot of rich authorities and a lot of ways to subvert the legal justice system. That's because the United States legal standard is incredibly high for criminal crimes. They have this, beyond a reasonable doubt. There are so many ways to stall it. There's so many criminal rights without remaining silent. And because the operations are so secretive, the person who consumes the drug and gives the drug and sells the drugs all remain secret together because they all don't want to go to jail because such a secret crime is so hard to charge. But in Mexico, particularly in 2006, they passed legislation that was pretty much if you're suspected part of a drug, they can detain you for a really, really long time, which essentially means that more individuals go to jail in Mexico, which means that more efficacy in that long end. But third, we also think production is important because what happens is in that specific country, the incipient crime was done there. He talks about in the very beginning how there's a string of crimes. The very motion of all these crimes to occur, the very system that allows these crimes to occur exists there, which we think justice is taking an understanding that not all crimes are the same, and some of them lead others to be committed. So ultimately, we think justice should be placed within that area. But fourth and most importantly, on the question of who has better deterrence, I think what happens is there's much worse punishments in places like Central America or Latin America, where what happens is drug punishers are incredibly heavy sentences. There's a large amount of retributive justice against them. The United States largely locks them inside prison systems. There's much more comfier. We think what happens is deterrence is much worse. Considering Afghanistan pretty much has a large policy where they almost hurt a lot of individuals within their kickback half.
But if the harms in the producer country are fueled by consumption in the United States, why isn't it better for the United States to try to address the problem and hence have no demand for production?
So you're talking about the efficacy of proportion, which is what my second contention is about, right? The importance of saying drug trafficking goes back. Because what happens is we believe you cannot win the drug wars without saying it back. Why is this so? Recognize that consumption peddlers, Mr. Speaker, are part of the drug gangs that are the semi-elite or the mid-tier or upper-tier people because they're the ones who are educated, they're the ones who are English-speaking, they're the ones who can go off the radar of the United States because they don't look like citizens who are peddling drugs, which means they're mid-tier elite individuals who have information. What happens is the country production needs these people in order to deal with the larger context of drug gangs. How so? First off, they do information through interrogations. Second is, they offer lesser sentences to mid-tier people to net in larger drug lords or to get information about how the operation systems work, which is much more important. For instance, we got Miguel Severas for the Zetas cartel 4 years ago through this exact policy where United States drug cartel people sent someone back. For instance, the leader of the Knights Templar last year was just killed through a similar policy of getting information from drug peddlers. And last week, the Sinaloa cartel's leader was also taken out by the Mexican drug cartels because they were able to get mid-tier individuals from the United States to get down there and then offer lesser sentences for them to pull in those people, which means a huge effective policy. Why can't the southern countries do this at all? One, they have way less information than the Mexican authority, who are in the country, investigating people all the time, and have all the connections and understandings. Second, they can't offer the kind of plea bargains that the Mexican government does, because they can't bring in drug lords without extradition laws, which the minute you issue an extradition law, the drug lord knows he's being targeted, it just goes away into hiding again. And most importantly, you can't offer these kind of plea bargains, because it's not legally actually viable option for you to say, if you testify for someone that we can't even bring in, then what happens is, we're going to give you a lesser sentence, which means no efficacy. And third, most importantly, you need to control this model, it doesn't work. Third, and really quickly, how does it disincentivize people more? What do you think about this when you bring the drugs back to the country, you see the public trial occur within the country, which shows that a lot of crimes are being tried, a lot of crimes are being affected, which means that this is not an effective policy at all. People actually see it. It affects their family members as well. It affects the local communities that see the crimes being committed. So ultimately, we think there's a much better deterrence and relieve its effect for all these individuals. For those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Is everyone ready? Yes. Mr. Speaker, we see a fundamental flaw in the logic coming out of the opening opposition because their argument is that deterrence is stronger now in the producing countries. If this is true, they would already be deterred. The problem is still continuing, which shows deterrence has fundamentally failed, which is why we're debating this motion in the first place. Now, my partner talked to you about why the model helps justice both morally and practically. He talked to you about why it's important for communities that are affected, places like Detroit from Mexican cocaine, etc., to have recompense. And he told you why practically it's better because it increases deterrence and also shores up the local legal system. What I'm going to tell you is a little bit about how this model helps international cooperation and why this helps more issues generally. But before I get to this main point of extension, I'll address some of the false arguments presented to you by the opening opposition. Now, the first argument is that now I want to make this perfectly clear. He started off his argument by saying the best way to judge this debate is whoever solves the drug war best. I will concede this point because there are three reasons why we solve this, why my partner told you. Number one is that we solve the crimes that are happening in the consuming countries, right? We think that the war can't happen if communities are not being affected. The consuming countries are the ones that drive the production, so it's better to focus on the consuming side. Second is that it increases deterrence against traffickers because they know that the justice systems in places like the United States as well as Western Europe, places that have developed legal systems, places that are not completely bought up by traffickers, are better. This was an independent argument that was not fully covered by the opening opposition. And third is that it lets the domestic legal systems improve, right? We think that at the point that Michoacan rose up in protest against the local law enforcement because they were completely bought off by the drug cartels, it doesn't make sense to focus on the producing countries ensuring legal systems. Rather, it would make sense for them to ensure and shore up their legal systems. This was an independent point that was conceded. My partner made it abundantly clear. The best way to shore up the local law enforcement is to make sure that there are legitimate exports that are made, and that is something that was key. Now, the next argument is this idea that the states have power against their own citizens. Well, one, we're creating a treaty, so the legitimacy will be shored up. Mexico will not seem badly because it's entering a treaty with one of its neighbors that it cooperates closely with. But second is that corruption that's happening right now reduces legitimacy against Mexico, right? The citizens have lost faith in the government, which is why Michoacan is in shambles right now. Now, the next argument is this idea of justice and justice for deaths, etc., being important. My partner answered this in his speech when he said that violent crimes would still be tried in the producing countries. And I also want to point out that this was on video, and he actually made this argument. So if you want to check the video. Now, the next argument is that the U.S. system is bad. Well, number one, the U.S. system is actually empirically better, even if there's some type of corruption. Because second, the Mexican court systems have been bought off, which is why even if the police catch them, they are let off again, right? We think that this is something that's uniquely bad. The third is that even local law enforcement has been perceived as corrupt, and that's why the local law enforcement were pushed out of the southern region of Michoacan. We think that if the citizens of Mexico no longer see the state as legitimate, a treaty would help in that regard. Now, the next argument is the idea that Latin America has more deterrence? No, this is false, because if that deterrence was there, the problem would have already been solved. And finally, this idea of less information being present for the United States, a treaty would shore up information sharing, right? We think organizations like Interpol function on this basis, right? We think that the idea of international cooperation is something that's very important, would lead to better kinds of systems of solving. That'll be my main point. But before that, I'll address back half.
If these governments are truly corrupt and accommodating of these drug lords, how likely is it that these governments will sign up to your treaty and extradite their citizens?
See, the problem is it's not the government that's corrupt, right? It's the local law enforcement. It's the court system. We think that the government hates the fact that Mexico is being destroyed by drug trafficking, right? But we think that the governments cooperating with the United States and have better law enforcement would be uniquely better. And that also goes against the point you brought up to you by opening opposition, because apparently the local law enforcement has better information. Now it's either one way or the other. Don't let them have both. Now my main point, the idea of international cooperation increasing as a result of the model. Well, cooperation over drug-related crime empirically improves cooperation and better relations on other issues. You can see this with respect to the United States and Afghanistan cooperating over reducing poppy production in Afghanistan. It led to increased research into things like health as well as AIDS, because there was a cooperative framework established through drug trafficking. There is a spillover effect when you have this type of cooperative framework, something that's uniquely important because it affects a lot of citizens within countries. Second is that the United States and Mexico cooperating over drugs and whatnot is uniquely important for trade relations, etc., because it means that we have a stable kind of diplomatic ties. This idea of spillover within diplomacy makes a lot of sense when you consider how governments do business. If you have iteration in the context of drug trafficking, you're more likely to cooperate over other important issues such as sex trafficking, such as other crimes. And thirdly, the information sharing basis of something like Interpol shows the idea of cooperation between governments being good, right? We think that the information that they want, the information that the opening opposition has emphasized, would be maintained as per the already existing international model of Interpol. We think we should strengthen such organizations via treaties. We think that doing so would pave the way for continued cooperation. But why is this kind of cooperation important? It's important because it solves the underlying problems of drug trafficking, right? We think that people do this because of poverty-related issues, because of poor social welfare, etc. We think that if there's increased cooperation between countries such as the United States and Mexico, they can focus on more important issues such as making sure people have access to health, making sure that people have access to education. This kind of argument makes sense if you follow the logic of the spillover of diplomacy. It makes sense because it has empirically happened in the context of the United States and Russia with respect to AIDS-related research. This is something that's uniquely important. And what's more is that it leads to an increased focus on international crime moreover. We think that setting a standard that's enshrined in a treaty makes sure that countries focus on larger issues of international crime. Things such as sex trafficking, etc., would be able to be addressed once drug trafficking has been addressed. We think that that means that we have a far better scenario for justice with respect to the model. Now, what has opening government showed you today? We've showed you that treaties are particularly effective by setting a standard for society, for setting a standard of cooperation. But more importantly is that it shores up the deterrent effect that they would like to maintain. We think that we not only ensure justice morally, as per my partner's argument, but practically by shoring up local court and law enforcement systems. But more importantly, we also show that we increase cooperation over a host of other important issues for governments. We think that this is something that's uniquely important and outweighs any argument that they can bring up. Because if they say that local law enforcement is effective, cooperation would be able to maintain the effectiveness of that. And for those reasons, we strongly urge you to propose. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank that speaker for his speech. Can I ask you guys to confer quietly when you do so, please? The acoustics is very nice as it should be. Sorry, they're not very good. Okay, Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Under the opening government's characterization, countries that produce drugs are somehow corrupt enough that they cannot catch criminals, and even they catch criminals, they let them go. But somehow they would be willing to sign on to extradition treaties, and then once they are able to catch the criminals, let them go. We think that this is a completely ridiculous conception, and I'm going to be dealing with this in my first point of contention on the idea of justice. Here's how extradition works, right? Extradition only really works when you have someone to extradite. If under opening government's conception of the way the world works, it's impossible to catch them anyway because the police system is so corrupt, we question how they think under their world they're going to catch people for extradition. And even if they do manage to catch someone, which would be extradition laws. Secondly, even if we provide that the government is like completely corrupt and everything, we don't think that they now have an incentive to sign on because it's pretty tantamount to admitting to the entire world that their system has failed. No, thank you. We think the idea right now is that you ensure that even if the system doesn't completely work, you don't throw out the system completely. You look for ways to improve the legal system within these countries instead. And we think that by extraditing prisoners over to other countries and consigning them to another country's jurisprudential system, you remove the domestic impetus to improve the system at all. No, thank you. Then they try to dodge this question by saying we will now try them for murder in these countries. Here are a whole host of practical considerations. If you try them in both countries, what sort of jail are you going to put them in? Because if you jail them in Mexico for murder and you want to jail them in America for drug trafficking, then we think that either the drug trial in America is going to be a complete sham because we end up back in Mexico where according to them they're just or if you leave them in America, then you're saying even if we try them in Mexico, the trial in Mexico will then be a sham because we're going to subject them to American laws instead. So we think this is a fundamental flaw in their case. Let's talk about some practical and principal issues of jurisprudence. Can you charge them? We think that in a case when no thank you, when states exist and have power over people precisely because these people have conceded that they belong to a certain state, that's where a state power ends. A state can only really have complete jurisprudence over its individual citizens, no matter how much harm is brought to the consumers. But even beyond that, we think there are a lot of practical considerations. Justin told you things about things like reasonable doubt that exist in most first world countries, where you can't even detain someone if you can't provide sufficient evidence that they were involved. And the problem is that the people you want to catch are the higher ups, who probably have millions of people to lie for them and deflect attention to. We think that the caste system is completely ineffective in dealing with this point. Morally, can individuals seek recompense? Like, sure they can if they were wrong, but the problem is that drug consumption is a crime as well, not just drug trafficking. So at a point when drug consumption is already a crime, it's very unclear to me why individuals should be able to seek recompense for committing a crime by choosing to take drugs in the first place. We don't blame the conditions that push them to take the drugs, we blame the individual in the law court because the individual chose to take drugs. No thank you. Even if we think that these individuals do have a right to seek recompense, here's the problem. Attacking drug traffickers doesn't encourage consumers to consume less. All they do is switch to another source from which they can buy their drugs. And let's face it, there are like many small sharks running around trying to sell drugs to people. You try and catch one drug trafficker, all this will make individuals do is to switch themselves to another trafficker. We don't think you solve the problem of demand in this way. If you want to stop production, you go straight to the heart of the problem. Last of all, on the domestic legal system, we need to fix the broken system. Why? Because if you say that the system will never, if you delegitimize the system now by saying they can never try the drug laws, then you're delegitimizing the system forever. Because now people never once again view the system as legitimate, or right now they kind of do. Because let's face it, they implement policies such as the laws where you can detain somebody if you even doubt their drug trafficking. And we think it's an important step forward. They have systems where you allow testimony in return for reduced sentences. We think it's tantamount, this information is tantamount in trying to catch the higher up. So we think this is also really important. Last of all, we remove that incentive to improve the system because now you are saying that the system is so illegitimate, we need to seek control from one government to another. And not only are you delegitimizing the system, the people are now going to see as the country and the government giving up on them because they understand they cannot protect their own citizens anymore. This moves me on to my second question on like diplomatic ties which came out from opening government second speaker. Here's the problem. Diplomatic ties exist only when trust exists and when both countries are on a roughly equal level. The reason why America and Russia have diplomatic ties that don't exist based on coercion because America and Russia are basically on fairly equal level when it comes to world powers. The problem now is that there's going to be massive colonial spillover, right? We think America intervening in Latin America in the 60s and the 70s has caused massive colonial remnants in the people's minds. This essentially means that once you try to establish diplomatic ties based on America, forcing their jurisprudence systems on other people means that you have massive causing people to remember the colonial sufferings they suffered under the American power. This is another case of Western imperialism and we don't think that people like this.
So the fact of the matter is that in your initial characterization of the flaws in this model, you extradite them if you can. If you can't, you try them for violent crimes.
Okay, this is like very lame. If you can't extradite them, then you're probably unable to catch them, try them for violent crimes anyway, so I like don't really see the problem. Okay, last question, drug laws and future crimes. We think that it harms, like the drug law essentially harms people in the countries of production in very fundamental ways. Because even if you don't consume it, you're probably press ganged into it. Under their policy, even the people who were press ganged into joining cartels because they were really scared of getting shot in the head are now going to be extradited and tried for something they were not actually fully complicit in. Even beyond everything, the existential threat to your life living in a country of production
quote the government seeking to
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the drug trade is a fundamentally international phenomenon. It entails a fundamentally international response. The task at hand in this debate, Mr. Speaker, is to reimagine the way we even see this problem and the ways we look at dealing with it. The biggest problem that seems to be coming out of opening opposition is the legitimacy of only one of the many enforcing bodies that will have to be working together anyway. And in order to make that case, they had to frame it as an adversarial, everyone's trying to outdo each other kind of scenario. I think that's a fundamental flaw with the way that they're even looking at things. This would be a fundamentally cooperative endeavor. But what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about enforcement. I'm going to be talking about how, though the motion only deals with conviction and trials, enforcement is going to be a significantly more effective thing given this policy because of certain already existing international frameworks and because of the incentives it creates by giving people a more direct stakeholdership in the situation. But before that, there's a lot more to rebut. So what we hear coming from opening opposition? First of all, the idea that you're delegitimizing states by undermining their authority. First of all, this would you have to realize that this is the rhetoric that is hidden behind by corrupt officials whose pockets are lined with the drug trade. And you do have to cast some doubt upon how much they actually feel hurt by these things. But even taking it at the worst case scenarios, we think that the instances of tension they were talking about were due to the fact that it had to be done illegally. We will be doing it legally through a treaty, but here's why we think that treaty will be an agreeable thing between all of those countries anyway. We think in terms of exchange, the cooperation eases up the US-Mexico border, for example. In terms of immigration control, there will be less armed activity going around that border, which will be a benefit to both countries. We think in terms of national will, none of these local governments are happy to be having to be the ones who are dealing with the drug trade. Happy to be the ones whose officials have to deal with the very well-armed, very rich, GDP levels of bribe money, cartels, right? Like literally GDP levels of smaller countries. Cartels who will just be bribing away most of their officials. They will be happy, we think, to share some of the burden. But right here, so that their enforcers will be capturing these people if you're talking about wanting to take credit for things anyway. But we think the larger reason here why they're likely to cooperate with each other is because there is no conflict of interest. They share the exact same goal of wanting to stop the drug supply. So again, we have to reimagine the situation. Reimagine this international support system for local police forces anyway because of a more direct stakeholdership. Because if you don't, then the national government in the country of origin will be suffering anyway. Because the war on drugs has an annual death toll in the 6 digits. It makes infrastructure unsafe. Look at Karzai versus the Taliban, for example. Before I get to my second rebuttal, yes.
If it's really true as they say, and Mexico is so corrupt it can't actually target any of the upper heads or doesn't need any of the information these boards have, then how is Mexico caught people like Ateneo or Michael Soredes, who are the head of the two largest gold cartels in the world, using this exact type of cartels that NTA talked about?
Because there are just so many chances for them to do things that eventually some of it will succeed. But we think it's extremely unlikely that they're ever really going to be getting to the root of the problem. Let's go back to some of their analysis. They're telling us that a lot of these Latin American countries have a lower bar for conviction and it's better off that people are tried there. That will maybe work in highly publicized cases in Mexico City, so maybe when they have to capture some of the biggest names. But the greater majority of cases deal with private armies, GDP levels of drug money for bribing, and an inability to guarantee the safety of the good guys. When you compare that to the USA, it has 25% of the world's incarcerated population, and a majority of that is due to drug-related reasons. But even if it is difficult to get the top dogs under the US system, it makes it much harder for these people to operate in the first place, and from a public administration perspective, that is already a win in and of itself. If these people have to watch their steps, feel like they're walking on eggshells, because if you reduce their organization operational capacity, you're reducing their economies of scale, and the drugs will be less available when you have scattered, smaller operations. But let's get to the heart of what I want to talk about in this debate in terms of enforcement and why we think that's significantly better under our side of the house, right? The situation in the drug countries, in the countries of the drug's origin was already laid out by the opening government. You cannot rely on weak states because they will be paying off judges there. Making bail will be an easy thing there, and there will be little political will to fix the problem in the long run because they'll be like these people will be lining the pockets of politicians, and they were likely not to get convicted until another drug dealer takes their place. So why do you think enforcement gets better anyway? Because we recognize that the motion sit down only directly deals with trials. Two things. First of all, many law enforcement officials on the ground, as in the police forces themselves, genuinely care about their communities and genuinely care about getting drugs off the street. You can see it's not all of them, but these people are there. They're the seed we want to get to. Because the second important thing you have to remember is that the promise of being able to handle convictions in stronger states encourages international law enforcement officials to support local law enforcement officials. For example, we think this policy will greatly empower Interpol, and we can expect many more forms of international cooperation in terms of international law enforcement for what is fundamentally an international problem. So how is this going to look like, right? When you capture a dealer on the street, you're going to ensure that the police on the ground, through training, equipment and facilities funding, and joint investigation efforts, aren't going to squander a majority of their opportunities to catch bigger fish during the interrogation, for example, which was their goal in the first place. You're going to get more leads, and you're going to be establishing probable cause through testimony and through whatever physical evidence these people may have, be it text messages or something like that. Through that, it's likely you'll be able to issue arrest warrants further and further up the chain using the exact strategies that they were talking about in opening opposition anyway, such as offering smaller fish lower sentences. That isn't the thing that is exclusive to Mexico. That's a strategy done in America all the time. If they both do it, presumably they will agree to do it when they're working together. What we're doing is we're empowering the good guys where they don't have a state to back them up by giving them access to the international community. We like that. We propose.
Here.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Now we welcome the first speaker from the opposing opposition teams.
We think that it's ridiculous that an Australian boy who carries maybe a packet of marijuana that is essentially harmless and can never overdose from it and brings it into Singapore. And the reality is that when he brings it to Singapore, this boy will put to death. We don't think that that's something that's fundamentally fair, and we don't think that this Australian boy is ever going to get adequate representation in Singapore because of the system, because of the government that wants to be hard on drugs. We think that Singapore is a benign example, and we think we put it in the context of the United States and Mexico, and replace the Australian boy, the Mexican boy, and replace the Singapore government, the American government. We think we have an even bigger problem. In our side, what we're going to argue for an extension is a concept that ultimately courts in the consuming country, in terms of its implementation and enforcing and prosecuting, are going to be fundamentally unfair on several levels. And when we think that in fact, the arguments about enforcement, in fact enforcement is going to be disarmed in the consuming production country. So, on to my extension, which will indirectly rebut a lot of things that they argue so far. If we were to agree with the context that drugs in the consuming country is such a serious problem, or be seen to be such a serious problem that it demands for important and harsh action, we believe that this is a government that is harsh on such problems, right? We see that in the United States, whereby 60% of the people who are incarcerated are in jail for drug-related offences. And in a show of force, they usually prosecute very aggressively, even though these individuals may have turned to drugs because of their unique circumstances. We argue that this is unfair on two levels. Firstly, that you have a particularly and extremely aggressive government prosecution. There's no regard for other elements of the law beyond solving the drug problem. And secondly, we argue that these individuals will be subject to extremely oppressive laws that they have never ever agreed to. Yes.
The crime we're talking about is trafficking, so it's not just about consumption and hurting yourself. It's about making other people feel the pain that your circumstances gave you. Why is that not fair?
Okay. Now, I can agree that ultimately this is a crime. But what we are saying is that in terms of the way that the prosecution is done, it's fundamentally unfair because of the way that this country is approaching. What we say to ourselves is more often than not, when it comes to a conceptualization of the law is beyond overcoming problems and deterring people from doing things. If that was the case, every single crime that is possible would be given the death penalty so that people would do it, right? But the reality is that these are laws that understand that crimes and prosecuting crime have to balance with things such as, for example, compassion and understanding of the culpability that's involved, as well as proportionality. So we don't think that it is a particularly universal idea that everybody deems the drug trafficking as something that is as severe as murder that they deserve punishment of being of death. We think that when it comes to, for example, things like crimes like drug trafficking and marijuana and a lot of other sort of drugs, we don't think that it really creates the kind of drastic problems that they are talking about, right? That in fact more than not it kills nobody. But what we say is that because of these governments are aggressively pursuing these individuals, even though that these individuals may have unique circumstances associated with them, for example, people who are drug mules who are forced into it, we argue to ourselves that their blind goal of being hard on drugs undermines the focus of the law, and this is something we should not subscribe to. Moreover, the reality is that when it comes to drug trafficking, given that it happens in a context whereby there are harsh laws against drug trafficking and there are harsh consequences, we don't think that individuals who are, what can afford not to do it, will do it, right? People who usually do it are born poor. People who usually do it are born because they're forced to. What we argue in this house is that the reality is that these individuals are unlikely to be able to defend themselves adequately in the court of law against these individuals, particularly in the court where it's not even conducting their own language. But more importantly, we think that the judicial system as a whole, that within that particular country, the bureaucracy in that particular country, in the constituting country, has no incentive whatsoever to ensure that this individual has adequate representation, right? Because we see that in the American judicial system, that criminals can't even get enough help in terms of representation. What more for individual that is somewhere else, they see as someone who even before trial, has already done harm to your country. So we think that that's fundamentally unfair. Moreover, it's unfair on the second level because laws are created based on a fundamental understanding of the law since you were young, right? We think that it's not proportional in this case because for this young boy, he never conceptualized the law to be just drastic to the extent that the marijuana that he smoked that harm nobody can cause him to die. We don't think that it's going to achieve the deterrent effect that they want to. But what more, members of the House, what we argue is that fundamentally unfair to the individual because it undermines the conceptualization and the basis of laws are made. Where in Singapore, the laws are made because they want to step out any problem and fine everybody for littering. But that's not something that Mexicans are comfortable with, right? And why do we think local courts are better? Their argument that local courts are not as good is because, well, they're just going to bail them out, they're going to prosecute them. Well, we think that maybe we can accept on some level that they may occur to higher level drugs. Maybe, right? But the reality is that when it comes to drug traffickers, these are not individuals and people that they care about. These are minions that they can be disposed of. So more often than not, there's no incentive for them to corrupt the system in order to do so, right? But what we say to this was more often these individuals are indeed punished. And why is this important? Because a lot of the reason why the drug cartels are being powerful is not because they are particularly corrupting the cause, it's because of constant recruitment. That they can find more and more drug traffickers over and over again to join their gang and do their work for them. What we say to this house is that in the context where you have cartels like La Familia being able to provide better welfare than the state, we think that if you send this individual overseas to be punished by a foreign devil, we don't think that it's going to help the government's impression that this individual is someone, this government is someone they can help, right? We think that individuals are more likely to join the cartels and feel the power of the cartels. So we think in our context we go better because we're able to deal with it more fairly and we have a benefit of opening opposition argument that this is something that is visible locally. But what we think is probably problematic is that in their role, in the extension that Nico brought up, is that, well, now somehow the international community will help these local enforcement authorities. Even without this policy, the US has been funding Mexico by the billions of dollars. We don't think need a policy to achieve that. But we argue that in fact, this disarms the local governments. Because the reality is now that you can no longer use the charges that they will levy against these local drug traffickers to use it and leverage it in order to get to the crime boss, right? Things like, for example, seizing the possessions, seizing information, and making sure that you can extract information from these individuals so you can get concrete evidence so you can eventually prosecute with the drug laws. If it's based overseas, you cannot use the information because there is no way whatsoever in local law. For all these reasons, because it's fundamentally unfair to these individuals and that it disarms the local ability of the state to deal with the drug laws, this motion must fall. Thank you.